Today, I'm talking about HDZero, or what is also known as Byte, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through the steps needed to update the firmware on your system. We're first of all going to take a look at the VRX or Scout HD process, and then we're going to take a look at what's needed to update the firmware on your VTX as well. Now, before you actually proceed, there are some things you need to be aware of, and I'm going to walk you through them step by step as we go through the process, and hopefully by the end of the video you'll understand what you need to do moving forward. Just before I jump into it though, I do just want to say, if you do find this video interesting, please do consider hitting the subscribe button. If you'd like to support the channel, there are links to our Patreon as well as links to equipment like this in the description too, and it's only by you guys using them am I able to keep making content like this. Anyway, let's get on with the video and let's see what this is all about. Okay, so the update process for HDZero is actually fairly straightforward. There are though two steps to it. You first of all need to update your receiver side, so either your goggles module or your HD goggles like the Scouts, and then you update your VTX. The process is that you download firmware files from the HDZero website, place them on an SD card, and for the goggles, simply put the SD card in and allow the update to complete. And then for the VTX, again, download the firmware files, place them on the SD card into the module. However, you will then need to connect your VTX to your module via this little cable here. When you got your goggles module, you should have had this cable included. However, if you did get the Scout HDs early on like I did, this cable wasn't actually included. Something else to take into account is this cable is very short, and one piece of advice I would give is, if you're setting up a HDZero system for the first time, I would actually update your VTX before fitting it into your frame, because it is much simpler to do on the bench than it is crammed into the back of the frame. One other thing I just wanted to mention before we move forward into actually doing the process is you need to also be aware of the formatting of the SD card you're using. My advice would be to format your SD card in your goggles module before actually using it. That way you know it's been formatted correctly and you shouldn't have any problems. I have seen some issues with formatted cards in the range of FAT32 and some with exFAT as well, so the best way is to format them in the module. That way it should go through without a hiccup. Just a couple of other little things to mention before we get started, and one of them is around the battery. Just make sure that you are updating the firmware on your module with a fully charged battery. It just helps reduce the risk of something going wrong, such as the battery going flat partway through the process. The module update usually takes 5 to 10 minutes, so you do need to make sure that there is plenty of power in the battery you're using and it isn't going to go flat halfway through. Furthermore, parts of this system also get quite warm in the update too, and I like to have a fan on site when doing updates just to try and keep the system cool. I have actually built myself a plug-in LiPo based fan based on a 40mm PC fan with an XT60 pass-through, and I use this a lot of the time whenever I'm testing the system on the bench or performing updates, just to get some airflow over the system whilst it's working. What I would say is just keep an eye on things, and if you don't have access to a fan, just make sure that the temps aren't getting too hot as the system is processing through the update. The last bit I just want to mention is, whilst the goggles module needs power whilst being updated, the VTX actually gets its power from the goggles module, so you don't actually have to worry about powering that as the process is being done. It's only the VRX that needs power, not the VTX itself. The first thing we're going to take a look at is updating the VRX, or the goggles side of things. Now, at the point of me making this video, we only have a goggles module or the Scout HDs. The update process is exactly the same for both. However, you do need to be aware that there are different versions of firmware for these two systems. At this point in time, there is no check in place in the HDZero system to make sure that you are installing the correct firmware on your module. It is extremely important that you do not put the wrong firmware on, otherwise you could end up causing a failure or a bricked device. I have actually done this myself, and there is actually a recovery process should you do that, and I'm going to talk about that in a separate video which I will link to in the description of this one. However, what I can't stress enough is before performing the update, make sure that you do have the correct files for your system. In the future, we may have different modules as well as different goggles, so again, it's going to become even more important at that point as well. Second thing I just want to mention is as you go through the process, it will also delete the files off the SD card as the firmware has been completed. On the receiver side of things, that's not really a problem because you're generally only updating one. However, on the VTX side, that can be a bit of an issue, especially if you have multiple quads, again, with the same board and firmware. There is, though, a way of preventing it doing that, and I will show you that as we move through the process as well. So today we're going to update the firmware on this VRX module. To do this, we first of all need to download the correct version of the firmware we need for it. Hopping over to the desktop, I've gone to the HDZero website. Now this is the best place to get the correct firmware for your system, regardless of who it's made by, if it's based on HDZero. It might be Byte, it might be something else, but HDZero's website is the best place to get the latest versions of firmware for your system. We click on support, click on downloads, and here it will give us all of the latest versions of firmware as well as manuals and everything else. The real nice thing with HDZero is they not only list the latest firmware, but they list previous versions on the website as well. So even if other parts of your system are not on the latest, you can either go back to an older version or update everything to the latest. The newest version is always listed at the top, and you can see the revision number is related to the date of release. So if, for instance, at the moment we're on 28/10/2021, and that is the date of release of the latest firmware, and you can then see the other versions are older versions based on their revision number. As you can see, there are multiple files to download, and this is where I stressed earlier, it is important you get the right firmware for the module you have. For instance, we've got firmware for the TX5S1, the TX5M1 and the TX5R1 boards. These are the different VTXs. We've got the RX 5.1, which is the standard HDZero goggle module, what was also known as Byte, and the one I have here. We've got the HDZero firmware for Scout HD goggles and the Byte Frost system. It's important we get the right one, so today we want the firmware for the RX 5.1, so we're simply going to download that. Once it's downloaded, you will need to unzip this and place the files within this onto an SD card. As I mentioned, ideally you should format the SD card in your goggles first. That way you know it's the correct format, because I have seen problems with things like exFAT. So what I'm going to simply do is extract the files to, choose the SD card. So for me, it's Lumix F. Click OK and allow that to extract the files straight onto the card. As you can see, I've opened the card and you can now see the 5 firmware files are on there ready to go. As I said, you don't put the archive on itself, you have to extract it and allow it to go onto the card and place the 5 files to update the firmware. Just one quick thing to mention, as I said earlier, was that when you perform the update and it goes through, 3 files will be deleted. The HDZero files and the Byte file will be deleted from the card once the update is complete. This is a quick and easy way just to check it has gone through. However, if you didn't want the files to be deleted because you had multiple different modules that you wanted to update, you can place a text file on the card as well that will stop the files being removed. To do this, you simply right-click, create a new text document and label it "Do Not Remove" in capitals. And that will tell the system to leave the update files on the card once the update has completed. Next, we simply then take our SD card, place it in our goggles module, making sure it's locked in correctly, and then we power the system up and the update should start. What I'm going to do to demonstrate this for you is actually plug the HDMI from my capture card into the module and actually show you the update taking place. Now everything's connected, I'm simply going to power the system up Once powered on, you will see the update begin and you should see it start to write the various files for the firmware to the module. You simply, at this point, leave it complete and do not turn it off until it tells you the firmware update has been completed successfully. Once the firmware update is complete, you can simply then power off the goggles and module, allow it to reboot, and then the firmware update on your module will be completed and this part of the process is done. And that is the firmware update completed on the module. The next thing we need to do is update the firmware on the VTX. As I mentioned earlier though, there are a few things you need to be aware of. As I've said, you don't actually have to power the VTXs externally. It will get power from the goggles module whilst it's performing the update. However, make sure again that you do have a well-charged battery because it is powering your goggles, your module, and your VTX as well. So do just make sure that it is all in place. As I've said, you will also need this little cable here. If you don't have this, you cannot perform the update. It is also very short. However, you can get longer ones of these directly from HDZero, and they will make the update process a little bit easier, especially once your VTX is in the frame. Next, what we need to do is make sure that everything is also connected on the board as well. So it needs to have its antennas and cameras connected. You should never do this without all parts on the system. It's important to make sure that all parts get updated and there's no possibility of damage as a result of something else not being connected. As you can see, we've now got our HDZero camera connected and we've got our antenna and pigtail connected as well. Obviously, if you were doing this in your frame, all of this would already be in place. So the process is to connect your VTX to your goggles module to update the firmware. The module should come with this little cable. It is quite short, but as I mentioned, you can buy longer ones as well. To do the update, you simply plug this cable into this little connector on the side of the VTX, and the other side of this then goes into our goggles module. If you're using the Scout HDs, there is a connector on the side of that as well, exactly the same as the connector on the bottom of the goggles module, and the process is exactly the same. Then we're simply going to take the other side of this connector and plug it in to the goggles module onto this port on the bottom here. As I've said, this cable is quite short, and as you can see, this is why I say it's a bit easier to do it at this point rather than in the frame. But if you're updating it after you've purchased the system, it is fairly straightforward. Just make sure that you have got plenty of space around everything to be able to plug it in. Next, we need to make sure that we've got the correct firmware for our VTX. Again, remembering that you have to make sure it is the right one for your board. As I'm using the Whoop board, this is the TX5S.1, so we're simply going to download that firmware again, and we're then going to extract this file to the SD card, just like we did for the receiver, making sure that the SD card is clear with nothing else on board, and this then will be the only file listed on it. Now I've extracted it, you can see we simply have the two files the HDZero system creates, as well as the HDZero TX file for updating. If you didn't want the file to get deleted after the update, as I mentioned on the receiver side, again, you would simply create a file called do not remove, and that then would allow you to leave the file in place if you were updating multiples of the same type of VTX. We are again going to simply take our SD card, place it into the receiver module, and then power that receiver module up. So I'm going to plug in the power cable into the side, and you will then see an LED turn on the module. If we then hop over to the HDMI, you will see that it is actually writing the firmware as the update proceeds. Something to note at this point, as you have actually seen, we have not powered up the VTX. The receiver module will provide power via the harness over to the VTX to perform the update, and you will simply see the little LED light up. And then if we check the process, you can see that it has actually completed and the VTX has been updated now, just like the receiver. At this point, I'm simply then going to power down, disconnect everything, and at this point, both our VTX and our receiver has been updated to the latest firmware. That is it. We have updated the firmware on the goggles module and we have updated the firmware on the VTX. As I've said, the process is fairly simple, and as long as you follow it through okay, you shouldn't have any problems. The biggest thing to understand is making sure that you are installing the correct firmware on the right parts of the system. Otherwise, there is always the potential to get yourself into a bit of a mess. And remember, if you do end up blocking yourself on your receiver because you have installed the wrong firmware or something goes wrong, there is a recovery process, and I will put a link to that video in the description of this one. Finally, all I want to say is if you found this video interesting, please do consider hitting the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the little bell next to it as well. If you'd like to support the channel, there are links to our Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, as well as links to this equipment too. And if you're after any more information, help or support, please do put it in the comment section, or check out the link to my Discord server that's also in the description of this video too.